welcome to Wordpath, the show about Oklahoma Indian languages and the people who are teaching and preserving them. Tonight we're going to talk about the language families of Oklahoma. That is, which languages are related to which, how we know this, and what it all means. First, if you'll permit me a digression, this can be a very technical area, and I'll try to give a little bit of a personal approach to the whole question of how languages change. My family is European American, and both sides are from Virginia in recent generations. For simplicity, let's set aside my father's side and talk about my mother's people for a moment. They're from a rural mountain area in western Virginia. So I have a lot of cousins around the town, little town called Clifton Forge, Virginia. Now I noticed as a child that my grandmother and my aunts on that side and all of those cousins spoke somewhat differently than my family did. And maybe this is one of the first inklings I had that I was interested in language variation and differences and description and so forth. The differences were sometimes of accent. I don't remember in detail all of the things I noticed. I wasn't that conscious about it, didn't take field notes and so forth. But I seem to recall that my country cousins sounded real country. They kind of sounded like what we used to call hillbillies, as opposed to us. And of course, we sounded very urbane and educated and proper, so I thought, until I moved to some other places and found out that I sounded like a hillbilly. But at any rate, there were differences of accent and sometimes also of expression and phrase, and particular words might differ. One I remember in particular was that thing you sit on in your living room. Most people call it a couch or a sofa, I think, in the United States. I was raised at my very early years, I remember calling it Chesterfield, and I remember that's what my grandmother and my cousins called it. And I think I called it that for a while, and then I don't know if it was television or school or what that exposed me to these other terms, and I and the rest of my family abandoned that term in favor of using sofa or couch. So within that one particular generation, our particular dialect of Virginia American English had changed a little bit. So our speech in my family had changed somewhat from that of my cousins. And some of the reasons were the fact that we were living in larger cities. We lived in larger cities in Virginia, and then we moved around quite a bit, including living for a while in New Jersey and in Canada and elsewhere. And so the speech within my family changed quite a bit, at least for most of us. My mother's very stubborn. She'll never change a thing. But most of us changed our speech somewhat, and we came to sound more like that kind of majority TV accent, non-accent kind of sound of English, I think. My cousins who still live in the country still sound more country to me. So what's gone on there is that if you can think of that as two mini dialects, the dialect that my cousins spoke and the dialect that my immediate family spoke, those dialects through the years gradually diverged from each other. And if that process went on for long enough, if those country cousins stayed in the country and had kids and great-grandkids, and we stayed in our more urban, educated setting and had kids and grandkids and great-grandkids, then the great-grandkids of the two branches of the family would probably have some trouble, or maybe the great-great-grandkids would actually have some trouble understanding each other. The differences and the difficulty in understanding each other would increase as time went on. And this is what happens with language all over the world on all levels. You'll have a group of speakers who speak the same, and for one reason or another, one group starts to speak somewhat differently. Different dialects develop, they diverge through time, and eventually it may develop into two different languages. And this is sort of how language families originate. So it's not only at the level of the family, like my personal family, my household, due to moving and other personal circumstances, but this is also kind of an aspect of community language use and language evolution. If we went backwards in my family another 10 generations or so, we'd find ancestors living in England, Scotland, and Ireland who spoke rather differently from either the way my family speaks today or my country cousins speak, even though they still spoke English as well. We were all speaking different varieties of English. So we're all familiar with some of the differences between different varieties. English, sort of English versus American English is one major split. And this split happened, after all, the Americans who spoke the early varieties of American English came from England. Why did their language change? Well, it was partly because they had immigrated, they were isolated now in a new land and didn't have day-to-day contact with their old former neighbors and community members. Also because they were exposed to a lot of new experiences and to a lot of other languages in what's now the United States. So they picked up some expressions from some loanwords, some borrowings from other immigrant families from other countries, and also from Native American languages from this continent. And these were things that their former colleagues back in England and Scotland and Ireland had not been exposed to in the same way. So the languages became two dialects and they gradually diverged through time. Who knows, someday maybe American and British English will be considered separate languages. I doubt it, but a lot of jokes, of course, are made about that. Two countries separated by a common language, I believe is the expression. All right, so what we're talking about here is that we can distinguish between, part of what we're talking about is that we can distinguish between two kinds of relationships or similarities between languages. There are genetic relationships, and that is those that are due to the fact that the language communities, their speech descended from a common ancestor, from the same mode of speech at some point back in time. And the other is the more superficial similarities due to things like borrowing or innovation in one language community or another. Many different kinds of contact with other languages can affect one or another dialect of a language and help it eventually to become a separate language of its own. But let's remember that borrowing vocabulary doesn't make your language cease to be your language. English, American English, has borrowed from languages from all over the world. A simple example, we've borrowed a lot from Spanish, but a lot of us have now in our vocabulary the word tamale, which is, before it was English, it was Spanish. I was about to say it was originally Spanish, but before it was Spanish, it was Aztec, so it's not really original with the Spaniards. At any rate, we have this word that was borrowed in as a Spanish word into English, and lots of other loans from Spanish. But our English, even though it has lots of Spanish loans in it, and more than in some English-speaking communities around the world, it still is English. It's just a slightly different variety of English. So all these borrowings, even though there are massive amounts of them, don't keep our language from still being English. They just help it to be definable as a slightly different variety of English. So what researchers do when they try to decide what language family a language belongs to, they're trying to define out what the genetic relationships are and which languages are descended from a common ancestor. They concentrate on what's called basic vocabulary, basic everyday words, names for things in the world that you're not likely to borrow terms for. The sun, the moon, the stars, earth, fire, water, walk, run, go. Everyday words that every language has a word for, and you'll probably not have much of a need to borrow a word for any of these concepts from another language. So this core basic vocabulary remains relatively constant. So if you compare the core or basic vocabulary of different languages, you can make some pretty good hunches as to which languages belong to the same family, meaning that they have descended from a common ancestor. Let's look further at this concept of genetic relationships between languages, which is one of the focuses of a field that's called historical linguistics. Now, there are about 6,000 languages in the world. There are at least 30 million biological species on Earth. Most of them are insects, by the way. I was just reading about this afternoon. Now, we're accustomed to seeing classifications of life forms showing species, genus, order, and phylum. I have a very simple example up here. It's actually not a very technical classification. It's rather loose, but just to give you the general idea of how you can sort of draw these tree representations of biological families and branches of families and how they are shown to be related to each other. So that we have some common ancestral carnivores here, which gave rise through evolution and I don't know how many eons to two branches of related but different animals. One branch includes raccoons and the red pandas. Another branch includes true pandas and bears. And then the branch that was ancestral to all the pandas and bears can itself be seen as having two branches. One is the branch with pandas in it. The other is the branch with bears in it. And under bears, we can distinguish, I think, more than 3 branches. Actually, I ran out of room here. But there are several different types of bears: black bear, brown bear, polar bear, and so forth. And so this tree shows us that the things within one branch are more closely related to each other than they are to something that's not in the branch. And the more removed things are through the branches of this kind of upside-down tree representation, the less similar they are as animals, and the more distantly into the past they were related by some common ancestor. We can do something very similar with languages. We can also group languages into kind of family trees, if you want to call them that. And here's an example that some people will be familiar with, even if you know nothing about Indian languages or linguistics either. And it's what's called the Romance language family, which is a European language family. It's within the Italic branch of a larger family, actually. But the Romance languages include, you'll see a lot of them mentioned here on the chart, Italian, Romanche, French, Provençal, Catalan, Spanish, Portuguese, Galician, and and I left one out on the right side. No, that's it. I'm sorry. Portuguese and Galician ends the chart there. So these are all considered Romance languages, and they're defined as having certain relationships with each other. These three, for instance, in the branch called Ibero-Romance, are from the Iberian Peninsula area. Catalan, Spanish, Portuguese, and Galician. They're very closely related to each other. They're not as closely related to French as they are to each other, though, because if you'll notice, you have to go to a separate branch to get to French and Provençal. And they are still more distantly related to Italian, still more distantly related, because we're going up to different branches, to Romanian, and still more distantly related to Sardinian. So they're not very similar to Sardinian, and yet if you compare the languages very closely, you can see that they must have shared a common ancestor. So that's the Romance family. And by the way, the ancestor language at the top, what linguists call the proto-language that must have given rise to all of this organized relatedness, is in fact called Latin, and we actually have written records of the Latin language, so we can kind of reconstruct from these daughter languages, as they're called, figure out what they must have derived from, and then check Latin texts and see if in fact those words occurred. And most of the research of that kind does check out with written records of Latin. Here's another language family. We'll get off of Europe soon, but another one that many people will be familiar with is the Germanic family, and one reason I mention it is because it's the family that English belongs to. It has basically three branches: a northern branch with some Scandinavian languages in it, a western branch with English, Frisian, Dutch, Flemish, Afrikaans, German, and Yiddish, and an eastern branch used to exist, including Gothic, but that's now extinct. So you can see that all of these languages, because they're within the same branch, must be pretty closely related to each other. Now, those two language families I just mentioned, Romance, which comes under what's called the Italic branch of a larger family, and Germanic, which is the Germanic branch of that family, they both are members of a family. The ancestor language has been reconstructed. We don't have written records of it, but it's been reconstructed and named by linguists Proto-Indo-European. And so the name for this whole grouping of languages is the Indo-European language family. And it includes, besides those two branches you may be familiar with, it includes Celtic languages, Baltic and Slavic languages, Albanian, Greek, languages of India and Iran, and a couple of extinct languages called Tocharian. Now, we do the same kind of reconstruction of unattested languages, that is, languages we have no written records for, when we compare American Indian languages, because most of them have not been written or have a very short written tradition. The writing won't help us very much. Some have never been written. Some of the languages we construct were never written down. How do we decide that things belong in these families? Let me talk just a moment about cognates. We can compare, when you talk about cognates, these are words in the various daughter languages of a particular language family, words for the same thing. In this case, we have the word for father. And these words, in each case, they'll be slightly different depending on the language, but they have a lot of similarities, such as these words for father in French, père, in Catalan, pare, in Spanish, padre, in Portuguese, padre. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. That's actually used only for priest and not for daddy. And in Italian, padre. So it becomes evident if you take enough sets of cognates like this, words for the same thing that have a similar shape, you can see what some of the systematic correspondences are between the different languages in the family. And if you compare all of these words for father, which begin with a P in the Romance languages, notice that in English, father begins with an F, which is very similar to its fellow Germanic language, German, where the word for father is written with a V, but it really is pronounced with an F sound. So these two Germanic words for father actually share the first consonant, namely F, Vater. Okay, so that's sort of how it's done. Let's now talk about Native American languages of Oklahoma after this long introduction, because I did need to make those concepts clear, I think. These are, I hope I haven't left anyone out, these are basically the languages of Oklahoma, and I've listed them in lines across this way, sometimes in groupings, sometimes no groupings. And what this is supposed to show is these are languages that we know to be clearly similar in certain ways, and to have these massive correspondences of cognate sets where a word for a certain concept will be similar in the whole set of languages. So each of these dots or bullets here represents a possible language family, and in a moment I'll show you what those language families are. I want to start, though, with the language Yuchi from eastern Oklahoma, which is called an isolate. That means that as far as linguists have been able to prove, it does not belong to any language family. There are a few languages like this around the world. Basque is another one back in Europe. So Yuchi is thought to be an isolate, which means either that its sister languages have become so different from it that we can no longer see the similarity and we can no longer discover what the family was, or perhaps its sister languages have all become extinct through the ages and it's the only one left from its family. Both of those are possibilities. We don't really know what's going on there. There have been suggestions that Yuchi is related to other languages, but I don't think it's considered really proven yet by most historical linguists. Here's a grouping. These are Apache languages, Plains Apache, spoken by the Apache tribe of Oklahoma, sometimes called Kiowa Apache, but I think that name is in disfavor in the tribe. And then there's Chickasaw Apache. This is spoken by the Fort Sill Apache tribe. So those two clearly are very similar. Here's another very large grouping. Arapaho, Cheyenne, Delaware, Kickapoo, Meskwaki, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and Shawnee. We'll see how they group in a moment. Here's another grouping of similar languages, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Muskogee. I'm using the term Muskogee to represent the language of the Creek and Seminole nations and a number of tribal towns. All very, there are some dialect differences from what I understand, but basically the same language. And another grouping, Caddo, Pawnee, and Wichita, share a lot of similarities. Another one, Iowa or Iowa, and Kansa, which is the language of the Kaw tribe. Osage, Oto, and Ponca all have a lot of similarities. Another grouping would be Cherokee, Seneca, and Wyandot. And then we have three languages here which do belong to families. It's been clearly demonstrated that they do, but there's only one member of each of these three families in the state. One is Modoc, one is Kiowa, and one is Comanche. And just to show, I won't have time to give you a lot of data on each of these, or really much data at all on each of these families. I just want to show you what they are. But just to show you that the same kind of process goes on as went on when the linguists compared the different words for father in the Romance languages. A linguist here has taken different words for beaver in the Caddoan language family, which includes Pawnee, Arikara, and Wichita, as well as Caddo. And we have three similar words for beaver. I'm guessing at the pronunciations here. I think it's Kituk, Chituk, and Kitis. They might not seem real similar to the novice, but to a linguist, even these sound differences that you see are pretty close differences. They certainly could be counted as similarities. And they show that there must have been a common ancestor language that gave rise to these three different forms. So the same kind of process goes on anywhere in the world that you want to establish language families and see how they developed. So here's the first language family we'll talk about of Oklahoma. It's called Kiowa-Tanoan, and I've put the Oklahoma languages in blue here. I hope I remembered each time. And other languages that are now spoken in other states or even other countries are in black. So the Kiowa-Tanoan family has two branches. One includes the Kiowa language spoken in Oklahoma, and the other is the Tanoan branch, which includes Tewa and Tiwa, spoken in the pueblos of the Southwest. Here's a very controversial language family. Some linguists think it's well established and others have quibbled about various branches in it, and I've left a lot of branches unspecified. It's a very far-flung family called Penutian. But one branch of this putative language family, this proposed language family, is called Plateau Penutian, and it includes a language called Klamath from the West Coast, which is very, very close sister to Modoc, which is or was recently spoken in Oklahoma, and it has another branch including Sahaptin and Nez Perce. Here's another very far-flung language family, but much more intensively studied, and I think the relationships are more well established. It's called Uto-Aztecan, and it takes its name from two of its member languages, Ute and Aztec. You'll see Aztec in the far right branch over here, a language spoken mainly in Mexico, still spoken by at least 500,000 people, I think. The leftmost branch of this family is called Numik, and this name is based on a word for person or Indian in these languages. And Numik, it has three branches, Western, Central, and Eastern. The central branch includes the Oklahoma language Comanche, as well as a very close sister, Shoshone, and a language called Koso. Other languages in this family are Pima and Papago, although these days they're known as O'odham languages, Akimot O'odham for Pima, and Tohono O'odham for Papago. Also Cora and Huichol in Mexico, Hopi, which you've probably heard of, Tabachalabal, Aztec. There's another very large language family of what's now the United States and Canada. It's called Algonquian, and it includes in one branch Blackfoot, And in another branch, in the reference I checked by Merritt Rulin, it was called Algonquian proper, which includes several Oklahoma languages: Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ottawa, very closely related to Ojibwa. These may be the same, I'm not quite sure, I'm not at all expert in this family. Potawatomi is another Oklahoma language in the Algonquian branch of Algonquian. Fox and Kickapoo and Shawnee are others. Another large family is called Siouan. It includes Mandan and two other branches. On the Northern Plains branch, we have Crow and Hidatsa. And all the Oklahoma Siouan languages fall under this branch called Mississippi Valley Siouan, which includes Dakota, Vegiha, and Jiweri Winnebago. Vegiha, these are the languages that are spoken in Oklahoma in the Siouan family, just within this little branch here. Omaha, Ponca, Osage, Quapaw, I'm not sure if that's spoken anymore, but it is or was spoken in Oklahoma. And Kansa, also kind of on its last legs. I think it's debatable whether they're fully fluent speakers of that left. But these have all been Oklahoma languages in the Siouan family. Now, moving right along. There's another family called Iroquoian. And it includes a northern and a southern branch. The only language in the southern branch is Cherokee, which is spoken in Oklahoma and also in the east, in Carolina. The other branch is called the northern branch, which includes, as you can see, various languages. Mohawk is one. And then there's a branch called Seneca Onondaga. And Seneca and Cayuga are two languages. There's a Seneca-Cayuga tribe in Oklahoma. Again, I don't know the exact details of how many speakers of each variety are left. But there certainly are Seneca speakers out of state, if not in Oklahoma, and there is a language program actively pursuing a revitalization of the language in the Seneca-Cayuga tribe. So, I think we have one more. Here's a very large a large family that's been studied for many years by linguists and anthropologists. It's called Athabascan. It includes a number of branches here that are spoken in Canada and Alaska and the Northwest. I won't even try to pronounce them all because I'm very unfamiliar with them. But there is on the right a branch called Apachean. And Apachean has two branches, two groups of languages within that branch. In other words, the branch on the left, on the chart I looked up, it was called Kiowa Apache, but I'll use the term Plains Apache for that language. And then on the right branch, that branching is called Navajo Apache. It includes Navajo, as well as a language called Western Apache. And then the other branch of it includes Eastern Apache, which includes Chiricahua Apache, and finally we get to an Oklahoma Apachean language. And this is the language of Geronimo's people and the Fort Sill Apache people. So you can see that there's an incredible diversity of languages in Oklahoma. And it really, we're on our last page, so I think I'll leave that. It really is a shame that so much diversity and so many windows into the past and the relatedness of human beings and human migrations and contact between peoples and so forth, all of this treasure of information that's carried in living languages is in almost every case severely threatened. Some of these languages, as I mentioned as I was going through the chart, I wasn't quite sure if we should consider the languages extinct or almost extinct. It's that borderline for a number of Oklahoma languages. Others are fairly healthy, like Cherokee, which has thousands of speakers still. In the United States as a whole, there are at least, by most classifications, at least 50 language families, but you can see that we have 9 represented in Oklahoma, so we have a very large diversity given that we're just one state in 50. And that's not surprising since Indian nations have come here from all over the what's today the United States anyway. So a lot of people have ended up here that were not here prior to European contact. So we're very lucky to have this kind of diversity in our state and this many different kind of windows on reality, and a lot of, if you're interested in studying languages, a lot of very interesting questions about language relatedness and language history that if you compare languages long enough, you can sort of begin to see into their history and make pretty good guesses as to a lot of things that happened before the era of writing, before European contact. It's a sort of way of making some hunches about prehistory that I think is very, very interesting. To give you an idea of the time depth on some of these, we talked about the Indo-European language family, which included most of the languages of Europe and some languages of India and that area of the world. The time depth there, in other words, the number of years you would have to go back to be in the era when that proto-language or parent language at the top was being spoken. That language was called Proto-Indo-European. Linguists have called it that. You'd have to go back about 4,000 years in time to get to the point when people were speaking an undifferentiated language that might be called Proto-Indo-European by us looking back today. And there's a similar time depth in the Uto-Aztecan family. You'd have to go back about 4,000 years to get to Proto-Uto-Aztecan, which later gave rise to Aztec and Pima and Papago and Comanche and all the other languages and all the branches of that family. So that's about the kind of time depth we're talking about. It's a far cry from my family and a few generations that I started out discussing, but the general principles are the same. And the key is that language is regular and language is social. You tend to speak the way the people around you speak, and people tend to, their language tends to evolve in not only in families, but on a wider level in communities. And so this really gives you quite an insight into history. I know we've covered a lot of territory today, and some of it went by pretty quickly, and we certainly left aside a lot of interesting questions of historical linguistics, but I just wanted to give you just a taste of what it means to talk about language families and how languages are related to each other and which language families are represented in the state of Oklahoma. By the way, I'd like to thank the Oklahoma Foundation for the Humanities for a grant that's helping with production and distribution of this program. Thanks for joining us tonight. See you next time on Wordpath.
Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaoni kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaoni kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaoni kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaoni kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaoni kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaoni kita.